Today we're going to take a look at a question that gets asked as a part of our Bible reading in a year plan, specifically from Mark chapter 11. I'm going to go ahead and read the account to you from Mark 11 verses 27 to 33, and then we'll talk about it. Specifically, this is Jesus being confronted by some Jewish leaders. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked, "and who gave you the authority to do this?" Jesus replied, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Tell me." They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven," he will ask, "then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin," they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority am I doing these things." Okay, so here's what happened. Jesus was in the temple courts, and he's approached by the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders, and they ask him two questions. They asked him, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you authority to do this?" So they asked him these two questions. Jesus then answered their questions with a question of his own. And when they failed to address what Jesus had asked of them, Jesus just said, "Yeah, I'm not going to answer you either." And this interaction, when you kind of think about it, it seems a little strange. Answering a question with a question, refusing to answer the question. Obviously, Jesus's authority came from God. It was a simple one-word answer to both of their questions. The answer was just God. So why didn't Jesus just come out and answer them? Well, let's take a look at what the Bible said happened before the interaction, and we'll see some context that should shed a lot of light on what exactly happened in the confrontation that we just read. Mark chapter 11, verses 15 to 18, this is just a few verses before, says, "On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, 'Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?' The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed by his teaching." Well, this part here that we just read is a very important part to consider for the other passage that we read before. This passage here tells us two things. It tells us what Jesus was concerned with when these events took place, and it also shows us what the Jewish leaders were actually concerned with as well. So starting with Jesus, his perspective on this. Verse 17, when he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?" When Jesus said that, "Is it not written?" he's referring to a passage from Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7. So God's house was supposed to be a house for all nations, a house of prayer for all nations, Isaiah said, and Jesus quoted that. So the point here is it was a house not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles as well. It was for everyone. Now, a quick note about the temple. The temple, we know, had multiple layers, and the Jews were allowed to go into the inner courts of the temple, but the Gentiles were restricted to the outer court. But no matter, the Gentiles could still come to the temple, they could go into the outer court, they could get close to God, and they could worship him there. It was an amazing opportunity for them. That's part of the point of why that outer court existed. But by the time Jesus got there, the Jews had filled up the outer court with all sorts of money changers, and there was like a bazaar going on in there. And it wasn't a good thing either. It was mostly corrupt practices trying to take advantage of the Jews who had come to worship there, as they were required to do. So as a result, Jesus cleansed the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers, and we all know that story. And in doing this, Jesus fulfilled prophecy from Zechariah chapter 14:21. That's a very interesting story about the fulfillment of that prophecy. We don't have time to get into it today, but that would be a good discussion for another day. So the temple cleansing account in Mark tells us what Jesus was up to before this conversation took place, where he answered the leader's question with another question. But as we've said, this passage also tells us what the Jewish leadership was concerned with as well. The passage said, "The chief priests and teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching." So that was Mark chapter 11, verse 18. They were mad about Jesus cleansing the temple. So by the time we get to verse 28, not all that far later in our Bible, that's the part where they ask Jesus, by what authority is he doing these things? And who gave you the authority to do this? We can pretty safely conclude then that when they asked, by what authority are you doing these things, when they're talking about these things, they weren't asking about Jesus' teachings. They were asking, by what authority did he cleanse the temple? And on its own, really, it's not a dumb question when we think about it. Yeah, there were things going on there that shouldn't have been going on, and there probably were a lot of people around who agreed with the sentiment behind what Jesus was doing. But we also know at the time that in the temple there was a dedicated police force, a group of people whose job it would have been to enforce anything that needed to be enforced. If corrective action needed to take place, there were people whose jobs it was to do those things. And so it seems to be on its own that maybe this is a reasonable question. If there's a police force who would be tasked to do this cleansing, who then, Jesus, are you to step in and do this on your own? By what authority do you do these things? So we have a question that might be valid and it might not be valid. So before he answers, Jesus tests them with a question of his own. He asks them about John's baptism. He says, was that thing that John was doing, was that from heaven or not? Now remember, John's baptism ministry was a divinely appointed thing. In Luke chapter 3, Dr. Luke says that John the Baptist was preparing the way for Jesus in accordance with prophecy from the book of Isaiah. So Jesus asks these leaders a simple question, and he was testing them to see, are you capable of recognizing divine authority or not? And of course, we see that the leaders weren't even interested in trying to answer the question honestly, and so Jesus doesn't bother to answer them either. There's plenty of passages in Proverbs that talks about or warns us against answering a fool in their folly, and Jesus was much too wise to engage in that sort of thing. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been interesting. And until next time, Lord willing, there is a next time. May God bless you and your family.